the board, and we're run by this board of directors that just has room for growth and more engagement in what we're doing and involvement, and it can be hard to kind of get them going. So a big part of what my typical day looks like is working on the cases, dealing with case management issues, trying to deal with our backlog and get these old cases that have been sitting for a long time, get them moving, get lawyers brought on to work on those cases, continuing to work to sort of identify and implement these best practices across all of what we do. So, we've brought on a new case management system, a new donor database, new fundraising systems, just all that kind of stuff. And a lot of that now is done by, for example, our operations manager or the development director. But my job then becomes sort of overseeing the staff and working with them to make sure what they're doing. So a typical day for me is litigation, staff management, and working on board related issues. And then things are really bad when you don't have a to-do list. So, things are good when you can identify what needs to be done and kind of plan for the week. But when you're in constant crisis mode and you can't even think about what your to-do list is going to be for the week, then it's time to kind of back up and reassess and take a deep breath, I guess.
Yeah. All right. So thank you for all those more generally based questions that are for me and for my own research and the stuff that I have to do for my side of the project. But I think at this point, let's get to some of the questions that are going to specifically help my product and my final proposal that I have to do. So thank you. What would you say, I know we already talked a little bit about obstacles, but what would you say would be the biggest obstacle faced by innocence projects, and thinking about, but I can always reiterate later, how those problems could potentially be solved?
Right. So, I certainly think there's not one problem. There's, like I said, they come at all these different levels. And if you start at organizational level, there's just this constant need for fundraising. So the more that you can reach out and educate and engage the community and make people see that this really is a huge issue, in that roughly 3 to 5% of the prison population in the United States right now on serious felonies is innocent, which is thousands and thousands of people. But it's not just those innocent people. It's when you kind of back up and can address what problems cause these wrongful convictions, you begin to see these patterns that repeat again and again in these cases. And when you can tackle those patterns, what they call them wrongful conviction factors, and you can sort of identify them and focus on them and attempt to remedy them, then you really provide a benefit for the entire criminal justice, for the guilty as well as the innocent. So some of those wrongful conviction factors that you see again and again are false confessions. That's present in roughly about 25 to 30% of all wrongful conviction cases involve people who confess to crimes they didn't commit. You've got another one is false accusations or incentivized informants. So you've got people who, for example, jailhouse snitches, or people who implicate others to receive a reward, or who are just basically making false claims. Then you have the huge. It's definitely one of the biggest problems of inadequate defense and inadequately funded defense. So the entire public defender system is just really at its wits end. It's just sort of crumbling across the country. I mean, some areas are better than others, but some are just in dire straits, and that really plays out in so many areas. You know, if you don't have an adequate defense, then you're not highlighting all of these other wrongful conviction factors, and it's just you see it again and again in these cases. And then there's prosecutorial misconduct that you see over and over, and that is everything from just intentionally hiding evidence and making misstatements and, I mean, framing people. You see that kind of stuff sometimes, but very often you see just your run-of-the-mill Brady violation, like these making these determinations either that you don't want to or you don't have to turn over evidence that could be exculpatory or helpful to the defense. And if the defense doesn't have access to the full story, then they cannot put forward an adequate defense. And that is just so, I mean, it's in all of our cases. And another major problem that you see are mistaken eyewitness identification. I mean, it's present in like 90% of GIP's cases, and in the vast, like 75% of all DNA exonerations involve a mistaken eyewitness identification. And then another big one is sort of flawed and inadequate forensic science. Everything from, you know, overstated testimony to just plain junk science being brought into the courtroom. And for each of these, there are ways to tackle and address those problems. You can pass eyewitness identification legislation. You can require recorded interrogations. You can have preliminary hearings where you have to meet certain criteria in order to be able to introduce testimony of incentivized informants or jailhouse snitches. You can provide more money to the public defender system. And, you know, the courts help when they do things like make decisions and rulings that, for example, require and define that adequate assistance of counsel involves thorough investigation and things like that, they just kind of set the baseline to cause people to be more effective in their representation of people. And then you've got sort of these bigger problems that overlay all of this, including just overarching discrimination, as well as the fact that there is no constitutional right to actual innocence. So you have a right to be presumed innocent unless you're proven guilty at the pretrial and at the trial stage. You have a constitutional right to due process and equal protection of the laws, which gives you a right to appeal and to make sure that your constitutional rights have not been violated during the process. But once you have done your trial and you've been convicted and you've done your direct appeal and your conviction has been upheld, then many of your rights disappear. And really at no point in that process, other than the right to be presumed innocent, do you have a right to actually not be imprisoned if you are innocent. And so we see it across the country and quite a bit in Georgia, where you have very strong evidence of actual innocence. For example, DNA evidence of actual innocence. And the courts say, well, actually, you're procedurally barred from raising this claim. You should have brought it up earlier. You weren't diligent in raising these claims. and therefore you just have to sit in prison, even though we all agree that you're innocent. And that's really a major problem that ultimately will need to be fixed by the U.S. Supreme Court. Um, so yeah, those are some of the problems.
Wow, yeah. So did you get a chance to read over the case of Sabrina Butler that I sent over?
I did.
You did?
I did. It was
Okay.
just heartbreaking.
Mhm.
Just and the fact that she got sent to death row for that. I
Mhm.
mean, I, I don't even see. I don't know the law in Mississippi, but that was just shocking to me. But her story, um, you know, 18-year-old black
Mhm.
female, small town Mississippi, young son who dies, and or is non-responsive, and she attempts to resuscitate him, and then he dies, and then she's traumatized, right? She's young. She's had this child very young to begin with. The child has now died. She's brought into the police station, and they begin interrogating her and putting all this pressure on her. She's traumatized. She's is just sort of ripe for a false confession, or at least conflicting statement scenario, which it sounds like that's what
She did
happened
give,
here.
yes.
Yeah, and then I saw in the little blurb that you gave me that her defense at trial was that she had caused the injuries to the child herself from her sort of, I think it described it as a clumsy attempt to resuscitate the child, which is ultimately what happened, right? So it's not the defense theory that was wrong, but it's many times you can't just rest on this theory, especially if you've got what appears to be a confession and a dead child.
Mhm.
You need to expend the resources and get experts in who can actually debunk the state's assertions and show. I mean, you're not supposed to have the burden of proof in these cases, but especially in ones like this, like, you really need to get the funding and have the experts come in. You've got the prosecutor who's apparently committing misconduct and making these statements to the jury about, she could have testified and defended herself, but she didn't. Fortunately, that's what caused the conviction to be overturned. And then, her next attorney is much more thorough, calls the appropriate witnesses, and the jury acquits. But I think that what you see there are several of the wrongful conviction factors and several of the things that we see over and over and over and over again.
Mhm.
We've got there's a disturbing number of cases where children have died, and the mother or the guardian is to blame.
Mhm.
And these are just the most traumatizing, horrific situations. And so many times in the end, whether it's shaken baby syndrome that they allege, or intentional abuse or neglect, or whatever, I mean, on and on, that someone gets incarcerated, spends years or decades in prison, and ultimately it's determined that no crime was committed at all.
Mhm.
And those are just really tragic. And then you've got um, just so many cases in where race is involved, and discrimination, and false confessions. And so yeah, it's a heartbreaking case, but not surprising.
Mhm.
Though the fact that she was sentenced to death row for that was really surprising to me, because even if even if she had done this, even if she had just lost it when her child was crying and punched her baby until the baby died, I don't understand how that can justify a death sentence in any circumstances, but apparently it did there. So
Mhm. Yeah, so those are two of the factors that you mentioned that I'm actually looking into very specifically in my final